William John Cavendish-Bentinck, the fifth Duke of Portland, possessed one of the greatest fortunes in Victorian England, and yet his primary ambition was to occupy no space at all. While other men of his rank built monuments to be seen, the Duke spent his capital on the architecture of disappearance. He did not build upward toward the light. He burrowed into the silence of the clay. This wasn't a hobby. It was a systemic withdrawal. Wealth was used as a scalpel to cut the self away from the species. To solve the problem of the human gaze, the Duke spent millions on the excavation of reality. He commissioned 15 miles of subterranean passages carved through the Nottinghamshire earth, not as sewers or service ducts, but as a parallel world designed to facilitate total human absence. At Welbeck Abbey, the ground was not the foundation, it was the hiding place. But as the Duke vanished into the darkness beneath his estate, a darker narrative began to take root in the surface world. Rumours of a double life as a London shopkeeper, whispers of a secret subterranean commute between a palace and a bazaar. A man accused of faking his own death to escape the burden of his own bloodline. This is where the mystery deepens. Decades after his disappearance, a lead-lined coffin in Highgate cemetery would become the centre of a legal war that threatened to liquidate the Portland billions. The question wasn't just where the Duke was hiding, but who was actually buried in his name. Before we can exhume the truth, we must first understand the biological betrayal that turned a billionaire into a ghost. We must look at the rejection that shattered his connection to humanity, and the industrial-scale paranoia that turned his estate into a fortress of the invisible. This is the forensic audit of a life deleted. To truly understand the man who would eventually bury himself alive, we must first perform a forensic autopsy on the vacuum of identity into which he was born. On September 17, 1800, the Duke entered the world not as an individual, but as a genetic repetition. In the Cavendish-Bentinck dynasty, naming conventions were not merely a tradition, they were surgically rigid. Every male heir was christened William. His grandfather, the third Duke and Prime Minister, was William. His father, the fourth Duke, was William. His elder brother, the Marquis of Titchfield, was William. In a family where everyone shared a name, the Duke was born into a state of permanent erasure. He was forced to exist in the margins, known only as Lord John, to distinguish himself from the carousel of Williams that preceded him. For the first 24 years of his life, he existed as the designated spare. In the high-stakes engine of the British aristocracy, the second son is a contingency plan, a backup drive for the family legacy. Lord John navigated his youth with the comforting assumption that the crushing weight of the dukedom would never actually settle on his shoulders. He was free to be unremarkable. He was free to be a ghost before he ever needed a tunnel. But in 1824, the primary drive failed. His elder brother died suddenly and unexpectedly. The transition was not a promotion, it was a biological violation. The spare was dragged from the comfortable shadows and thrust into the blinding, unforgiving light of the heir apparent. The identity of the Duke was forced upon him like a heavy, lead-lined shroud. He didn't just inherit a title, he inherited a role he was psychologically incapable of playing. The forensic record suggests that he spent the remaining 55 years of his life trying to claw back the anonymity he lost the day his brother died. He wasn't building tunnels to be eccentric. He was building them to return to the safety of the spare he was always meant to be. He was a man trying to reverse his own birthright. Lord John was educated entirely at home, insulated from the social friction of his own class. While his peers were being tempered in the fires of Eton and Westminster, he was kept in a domestic vacuum. Contemporary accounts describe a child of profound awkwardness who sought physical refuge behind his mother Henrietta's skirts, using her as a human shield against the gaze of the world. But in the forensic record of the Cavendish-Bentinck's, delicate health was a euphemism for a much more visceral, agonizing reality. Bullous pemphigoid. This was an autoimmune betrayal. His body was mistakenly attacking the basement membrane zone of his skin, resulting in large, eruptive, fluid-filled blisters. Imagine the day-to-day existence. A young man of the highest rank required to wear stiff, starched linen and formal wool suits, while his skin was a landscape of weeping sores. But the disease was only half of the horror. We must look at the Victorian cures that likely finished the job. In the 1800s, a man of his stature was subjected to a gauntlet of toxic interventions. Physicians regularly prescribed arsenic to purify the blood. They used mercury, a potent neurotoxin, to treat skin eruptions. They performed systemic bloodletting to balance the humours. Forensic analysis suggests the Duke wasn't just hiding because of the blisters, he was hiding the results of his treatment. Chronic arsenic ingestion causes hyperpigmentation, leaving the skin with a raindrop appearance, patches of dark and light skin that look like a permanent stain. Mercury leads to neurological decay, tremors, and the eventual loss of teeth. The Duke was being physically liquidated by the very people paid to save him. The tunnels weren't just a place to hide his face, they were a place to hide the evidence of a medical crime. He was a man in permanent physical agony, scarred, poisoned, and neurologically frayed. He became a biological pariah before he ever reached middle age. The definitive break from humanity occurred in 1834. Lord John proposed marriage to the opera singer, Adelaide Kemble. This was his last, desperate bridge to the human species. Kemble was a woman of art and emotion, someone who lived in the light of the stage, the total opposite of the Duke. In proposing to her, Lord John was making a final attempt to anchor himself to the world of the living. The rejection was absolute and humiliating. Kemble did not just say no. She revealed she was already secretly married to a man of significantly lower rank. In the rigid social circles of the Victorian elite, the news travelled with forensic speed. The spare William, the man with one of the world's largest fortunes, had been rejected for a commoner. This was the day Lord John died. The rejection, combined with the physical agony of his skin and the toxic burden of his medical treatments, completed his psychological withdrawal. He realized that wealth could buy him an army of servants, but it could not buy him a face that a woman could look at without recoiling. He decided that if the world would not let him be human, he would ensure the world could never see him again. He spent the next 20 years in a state of suspended animation, waiting for his father to die, so he could finally use his fortune to build the void. The transition from the Duke's internal biological prison to his external architectural fortress began in 1854 with a masterstroke of strategic resource management. When the fifth Duke ascended, he looked at his vast reserves of oak and saw a raw, industrial stockpile. But to achieve the silence he craved, he first had to unleash a hellish symphony of noise. For 25 years, Welbeck Abbey was not a place of quiet reflection. It was a permanent industrial war zone. To understand the psychological toll of this era, one must hear it. The silence the Duke eventually achieved was bought with decades of industrial thunder. Imagine the air thick with the screams of 15,000 men, the rhythmic clanging of iron picks against unyielding stone, and the constant, panicked braying of thousands of donkeys used as pack animals in the knee-deep mud. The grinding of steam-powered saws echoed through the valley like a permanent scream, processing the very timber intended to frame his disappearance. He was felling thousands of ancient oaks, trees planted by his father as a legacy of family strength, and lowering their massive trunks into the wet clay to frame his abyss. He was using the bones of his ancestors' forests to build a world where those ancestors could no longer reach him. He lived at the epicenter of this cacophony, a man who hated being perceived, yet who presided over a site that could be heard from the next county. Every hammer blow was a contradiction. He was creating a loud, violent world in order to never have to hear a human voice again. The engineering of the Welbeck tunnels produced a forensic crisis: the waste. Millions of tons of Nottinghamshire clay were being ripped from the bowels of the earth. Where do you hide the guts of the planet? To move this much material today, would require a fleet of modern heavy machinery. In 1860, it required a logistical miracle of muscle and iron. Forensic estimates suggest the excavation produced enough material to fill a fleet of ships, yet the dirt never left the estate. The Duke utilized the math of the dirt to further his own erasure. He utilized the excavated waste of his tunnels to build massive, artificial embankments, man-made hills, some rising nearly 40 feet high, strategically placed to block the view of the Abbey from the surrounding roads. He was terraforming his own world. He spent a fortune to make the landscape itself a liar. He didn't just want to be underground. He wanted to ensure that even if someone stood on a high hill miles away, they would see only the dirt he had moved and never the house he occupied. He was using the earth as a literal curtain. The very ground you stood on at Welbeck was a manufactured deception, a layer of recycled clay designed to swallow a billionaire. To achieve total solitude, the Duke was forced into the ultimate irony. He had to invite a small army onto his front lawn. Between 1,500 and 15,000 labourers were active on the estate for a quarter of a century. The Duke sought to occupy no space, yet he presided over the largest private construction site in Europe. He managed this friction through the invisibility rule. To look at the Duke was to commit a terminal offence. The horror of the labour was compounded by the silence of the master. There is a documented account of a labourer who, out of habit, simply tipped his hat in a respectful greeting as the Duke passed. The man was fired on the spot. To be acknowledged was to be attacked. Yet, his ledgers reveal a complex generosity twist. While he would dismiss a servant for a single glance, he would often continue to pay their full wages and pensions in secret. He hated the human gaze, but he was haunted by the poverty it represented. He provided donkeys and umbrellas to his staff, not out of kindness, but as a calculated logistical move. The donkeys ensured they reached their posts in the distant tunnels without loitering near the Abbey out of exhaustion. The umbrellas ensured that if it rained, they wouldn't cluster near his windows for shelter. He subsidized their comfort to buy their distance. He was paying them to be ghosts, just like him. The engineering of the tunnels was a surgically precise map of avoidance. Tunnel number 1 was the primary artery, stretching approximately 1.25 miles. It was a masterpiece of Victorian transit, wide enough for 2 carriages to pass comfortably, allowing the Duke to leave his estate without ever being exposed to the open air. Parallel to these grand corridors were the worker tunnels, roughly constructed, damp and devoid of the bullseye skylights that graced the Duke's private paths. These were the veins of the estate. This ensured that labour could move through the earth like blood through a vein, never crossing the path of the master, who funded their existence. The Duke utilized vertical connectors, industrial-grade hydraulic lifts capable of carrying 20 people from the surface directly into the deep. He was hollowing out the verticality of his life, ensuring that every transition was managed by iron and steam rather than human interaction. A world built 60 feet underground requires a massive energy input. The Duke was obsessed with light, yet he refused the sun. During the day, he utilized thousands of bullseye domed skylights set into the lawns above. These thick glass apertures flooded the tunnels with a strange filtered daylight, a light that had no heat, no UV, and no risk to his sensitive, blistered skin. At night, the system shifted to artificial power. He commissioned a private gas manufacturing plant on the estate grounds solely to feed his subterranean network. Thousands of gas jets lined the corridors and chambers, burning constantly. The riding house alone was lit by 4,000 gas jets, enough to illuminate a city street. This was the lighting bill of paranoia. The Duke was effectively paying for a second sun, a regulated artificial star that he could control within the confines of his tunnels. He had replaced the natural heavens with a network of iron pipes and burning gas. The ground was no longer the foundation of his home, it was the material he used to drown out the world. While the subterranean tunnels provided the Duke with a means of invisible transit, his stationary life was confined to a high-security domestic vacuum. He occupied a suite of 4 or 5 rooms in the west wing of Welbeck Abbey. a space that functioned as a biological and psychological bunker. These were not the rooms of an aristocrat. They were the rooms of a man who had liquidated the very concept of luxury. The aesthetic was surgically minimal. The Duke ordered every piece of traditional finery, the tapestries, the heavy velvet curtains, and the ancestral portraits, to be stripped from the walls and placed into deep storage. What remained were bare floors and a singular recurring visual choice. Every wall was painted pink. Forensic analysis of this pink aesthetic suggests a motivation far deeper than a mere eccentricity of taste. In the 19th century, the specific hue chosen was a recognized surrogate for a healthy flesh tone. The Duke lived in a world of constant biological betrayal. His skin was a landscape of eruptive blisters and weeping sores caused by his bullous pemphigoid. By surrounding himself with pink walls, he was effectively living inside a physical filter. In a white or neutral-toned room, the visual severity of red, inflamed lesions is amplified by the contrast. But under the warm, low-frequency glow of his 4,000 gas jets, the pink-painted walls acted as a medical dressing for the eyes. The color neutralized the appearance of his own decay. He was surrounding himself with the color of the human skin he couldn't stand to show or touch, creating a clinical environment where his biological failures were rendered invisible, even to himself. He was living inside a simulated body of paint and gaslight, a man masquerading as healthy within the confines of a tinted void. The Duke's nutritional needs were managed with an industrial detachment that bordered on the robotic. He was obsessed with purity and the absolute avoidance of human contaminants. To facilitate this, the estate utilized a miniature underground railway. This transit system linked the distant kitchens directly to the Duke's private suite, ensuring that no human hand ever had to carry a tray through his halls. The logistics were absolute. A roasted chicken was required to be ready at every hour of the day and night. This was the perpetual chicken protocol. The food was loaded onto heated rail cars, specialized trucks designed to maintain a precise, clinical temperature during their journey through the dark. If a meal arrived and the temperature had dropped by even a few degrees, the Duke would refuse it. The entire train would be sent back through the tunnel. He did not want a meal prepared by a human. He wanted a result delivered by a machine. The vertical connectors, mechanical gadgets and lifts, would hoist the tray from the subterranean line directly into his rooms. He never saw a chef. He never heard a waiter. He ate in total silence, the food appearing as if by magic, delivered by iron and steam. His survival had been successfully automated. He had reduced the act of eating to a mechanical input, a transaction between his body and his infrastructure. Communication with his multi-million-pound empire was mediated through a specialized mechanical interface. The Duke did not speak to his staff. He issued commands through wood and metal. The primary artifact of this protocol was the bedroom door, which featured a unique modification, a double letterbox system. One slit was designated for incoming correspondence, and the other for outgoing notes. This was the command center of his invisible bureaucracy. From this room, he dictated the planting of forests, the management of thousands of workers, and the technical specifications of his tunnels. His instructions to tenants and workmen were delivered exclusively in writing. If a servant required a decision, they submitted a note. They did not knock. No one called out. The Duke remained a silent hierarchy, a master who was heard through the scratching of a pen, but never seen through the opening of a door. He governed like a ghost, haunting his own ledger. Within this mechanical world, there was one singular exception to the rule of absence: the valet. This lone individual was the only human being allowed to look at the ghost. He was the witness to the Duke's slow biological liquidation. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. To be the only person in a 15,000-person ecosystem permitted to see the reality behind the curtains. The valet was the human bridge in a world that had burned its bridges. He saw the Duke in his most vulnerable state, the application of medical dressings, the tremors of a poisoned nervous system, and the sheer, exhausting effort required to maintain a fortress of solitude. To the world, the Duke was a mystery. To the valet, he was a deteriorating man trapped in a pink room. The valet managed the invisible carriage and the worksop station rituals, ensuring that the cargo was moved without ever being exposed to the air. To maintain this vacuum, the Duke managed the thousands of men on his lawn with a distorted form of empathy. This was the donkey and umbrella protocol. He provided every worker with a donkey to ensure they reached their posts in the distant tunnels without loitering near the Abbey out of exhaustion. He issued thousands of umbrellas so that, if it rained, they wouldn't cluster near his windows for shelter. He was not providing for their comfort, he was buying their distance. He subsidized their lives to ensure they remained shadows on the edge of his vision. By the end of this chapter, the Duke had successfully replaced every human connection with a mechanical one. His food came by rail, his orders went by letterbox, his body was moved by armored carriage. Other people were merely a series of notes and distant shovel strikes. But as the Duke refined his disappearance, the vacuum he created began to pull in the imaginations of the public. The void was no longer just a place, it was a mystery. And a mystery this large eventually invites a story so surreal it would lead to a ghost party in a ballroom built for thousands but occupied by only one. To understand the true depth of the Duke's withdrawal, we must leave the sprawling subterranean networks of Nottinghamshire and look toward the heart of the British Empire. Wealth in the 19th century usually sought the most prominent stage, the glittering ballrooms of Belgravia or the visible power of Mayfair. But for the fifth Duke, urban capital was sought for its ability to provide the most efficient shroud. Harcourt House, located in Cavendish Square, was a massive, somber stone mansion. Under the Duke's direction, it was modified into a clinical urban vacuum. This was not a residence, it was a fortified observation post designed to allow the Duke to exist in the center of a metropolis of millions, while technically occupying a void. He was a man living in the eye of the storm, utilizing the sheer density of London as a layer of insulation. The most striking evidence of this urban paranoia was the construction of the urban screens. To ensure his total invisibility, the Duke commissioned the erection of massive glass screens, 80 feet high, to encircle the rear of the property. From the Duke's perspective, these were filters for the human gaze, but to the residents of Cavendish Square, they were an architectural nightmare. Imagine living in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the world and waking up to a giant frosted wall rising 80 feet into the air, a translucent monolith that swallowed the light and blocked the sky. To the neighbors, Harcourt House did not look like the home of a peer of the realm. It looked like a high-security prison or a gargantuan tomb. The fear among the local population was palpable. Because they could not see in, they filled the darkness with their own terrors. Rumors circulated that the house was a site of occult ritual, or that the Duke was keeping a nameless prisoner behind the glass. The urban screens were so high and so thick that they effectively silenced the house, turning a multi-million-pound mansion into a mute, glass-encased gargoyle in the middle of a bustling square. The Duke had successfully deleted himself from the line of sight of every living soul in London, but in doing so, he had turned his home into a visual scar on the city's face, a monument to the fear of being seen. The forensic record reveals a man obsessed with the moment of transition, the few vulnerable seconds between the safety of his front door and the safety of his carriage. In London, he had only the sidewalk, a public space he could not control. To manage this, he developed a decoy system. When his carriage arrived, the horses were often kept in a state of readiness for hours, a high-cost mechanical idling that ensured the Duke could flee at a moment's notice. The carriage was not a luxury, it was a mobile extension of his bunker. When the Duke moved from his London bunker back to his Nottinghamshire fortress, he did not travel as a passenger. He travelled as cargo. The ritual was surgically precise. The Duke would enter his invisible carriage, a horse-drawn module with double-thick leather curtains permanently drawn, inside the internal courtyard of Harcourt House, safely behind the screens. The carriage was then driven to the station, where a specialized flatbed railway van awaited. Without ever stepping onto the platform, without ever breathing the soot-filled air of the station, the entire carriage, with the Duke sealed inside, was hoisted directly into the railway van. He was loaded like freight. As the train steamed toward Worksop Station, the Duke sat in a dark, pressurized cabin of silence, suspended inside a box, inside a larger box. When the train arrived in Nottinghamshire, the carriage was unloaded and driven directly into the subterranean mouth of the Welbeck tunnels. From his bedroom in London to his bunker in the country, the Duke never once occupied a public space. He was a billionaire who had successfully achieved the logistics of a ghost. He had reduced his physical existence to a shipping manifest. At Harcourt House, we find the primary command center of the Portland Empire. Here, the Duke managed his vast holdings, not through meetings or social influence, but through an intricate, silent bureaucracy. His primary agent, Mr. Bescher, managed thousands of tenants and massive revenue streams for years, yet the two men reportedly never met face to face. This was corporate noir in its purest form. All instructions were mediated through the mechanical interface of the double letterbox. He was a phantom executive, a ghost at the head of the table, who governed through the scratching of a pen on pink stationery. The pathology of Harcourt House proves that the Duke's condition was not a choice of country living. It was a systemic refusal of the human species. He had achieved the ultimate wealth pathology, the ability to be physically present in the center of civilization, while being psychologically and visually absent. But as the Duke refined his urban disappearance, the vacuum he created began to pull in the imaginations of the public. The void was no longer just a place, it was a mystery, and that mystery would eventually invite a fraud so massive it would lead the British legal system into the high-security vaults of Highgate Cemetery. While the tunnels and the urban screens were built to facilitate the Duke's absence, his most ambitious project was designed to host a presence that never arrived. This was the great underground ballroom. It was a subterranean cathedral that defied the physics of its own location. A hall of such staggering dimensions that it remained, for decades, one of the largest private indoor spaces on the planet. To prevent the space from feeling like a tomb, the Duke performed a technical defiance of reality. He ordered the ceiling to be supported by massive metal girders and painted with a sprawling, vibrant mural of a giant, eternal sunset. 60 feet below the Nottinghamshire grass, he had commissioned an artificial sky. He wanted to ensure that the transition from the surface to the deep was not a descent into darkness, but a passage into a regulated, permanent evening. This was the ultimate manifestation of his wealth, the ability to manufacture a horizon where the sun never set and the human gaze never penetrated. The most surreal image in the entire forensic record of the Cavendish-Bentinck line is not the Duke's absence, but his solitary motion. In his later years, as the mercury poisoning and the arsenic treatments began to fray his nervous system, the Duke began to use the vast mirror-polished floors of the ballroom for solitary roller skating. Picture the scene through a forensic lens, an elderly, blistered man, his body scarred by a lifetime of autoimmune war, gliding in wide, silent circles under a painted sunset. There were no guests, there was no music, there was only the rhythmic, mechanical whir of skate wheels echoing off the subterranean walls. The sound would have been deafening in the stillness, a metallic scratching against the polished wood that served as the heartbeat of his isolation. He had built a space capable of holding 2,000 dancers, only to use it as a billion-dollar gym for a man who moved only in loops. This was the Ghost Party, a performance of aristocratic leisure where the performer was also the only witness. To populate this terrifying emptiness, the Duke utilized the ancestral portraits he had stripped from the walls of Welbeck Abbey. He hung over 2,000 paintings within the underground gallery, creating a silent, frozen audience to watch his solitary lapse. Forensic analysis of this choice reveals a chilling psychological logic. The Duke did not necessarily hate the human form. He hated the judgment of the living gaze. He preferred the company of the dead because they couldn't blink. They couldn't recoil at the eruptive lesions on his skin. They couldn't judge the tremors in his hands or the heavy leather curtains on his carriages. He had created a social life that was entirely static, a world where he was surrounded by thousands of eyes, yet none of them were actually watching. He was skating through a forest of his own history, a man surrounded by a family he had spent his entire life trying to delete. To facilitate the arrival of the guests he never intended to invite, the Duke integrated a massive hydraulic lift into the ballroom's design. It was an industrial marvel, capable of carrying 20 people from the surface directly into the chamber in a single sweep. It stood as a permanent threshold to a non-event. The machinery was tested daily by the silent army of engineers. The thousands of gas jets were kept lit and burning at a massive cost. The floors were polished to a mirror finish every single morning. The capacity was ready. The stage was set. The light was perfect. But the lift remained empty. He was a man obsessed with the potential of connection, provided it never became a reality. He was maintaining a museum of what if, a subterranean monument to a social life that had been successfully liquidated. By the late 1870s, the Duke's disappearance was total. He had successfully hollowed out the world around him, creating an identity vacuum. But in physics, a vacuum must be filled. Because he had spent a quarter-century liquidating his own image, the public possessed no verifiable proof of who the Duke actually was. To the Victorian mind, a man who hides with such industrial intensity must be hiding a dark secret. They could not accept that he was simply a man in pain. They needed him to be a villain. This vacuum became the engine for the Druce-Portland myth. It was the belief that the Duke wasn't skating alone in a bunker, but was instead leading a secret, criminal life as a London shopkeeper. The public's need to see him, to fix a face to the name, would eventually lead them to the high-security vaults of Highgate Cemetery. They were coming for him, and even 15 miles of tunnels would not be enough to keep the world from forcing a resolution. When the 5th Duke of Portland died on December 6, 1879, he left behind a vacuum of identity that the British public was biologically incapable of leaving empty. In the Victorian era, visibility was the primary currency of moral accountability. A man who hid with the industrial intensity of the Duke was not merely viewed as a recluse, he was seen as a criminal in waiting. The public could not reconcile his vast, sprawling wealth with his total physical absence. They could not accept the clinical truth that he was a man in agony, hiding the scars of arsenic and autoimmune decay. They needed a story that matched the scale of his tunnels. They preferred the high-stakes fiction of a double life, the idea of a duke masquerading as a furniture dealer named Thomas Charles Druce, over the mundane tragedy of a man skating alone in a pink-walled bunker. The Druce-Portland claim was a psychological projection. It was a way for the masses to punish a man who had the audacity to be rich, yet refused to be seen. If he wouldn't show his face, they would invent a second one for him. For 10 years, the Druce-Portland case functioned as a slow-motion autopsy of the Duke's privacy. It drained the fortunes of hopeful investors and occupied the highest courts of the land. It only ended on the cold, foggy morning of December 30th, 1907, when a forensic team arrived at Highgate Cemetery to perform the ultimate audit. The atmosphere at Highgate was thick with a morbid, desperate tension. A massive crowd gathered outside the cemetery gates, kept back by a heavy police presence. These were the Druce bond holders, people who had gambled their life savings on the chance that the Duke was a fraud. They weren't just looking for justice, they were looking for a payout. If the vault of T.C. Druce was empty or filled with lead weights, the Portland billions would be liquidated and redistributed. But if it contained a body, the Duke's 25 years of silence would be finally and irrevocably vindicated. The exhumation was a masterclass in Victorian mechanical labor. It took hours of rhythmic hammering to break through the multi-layered brick and stone of the Druce vault. As the workmen reached the central casket, the air in the tomb grew heavy and stagnant. This was a lead-lined coffin, a high-security vessel designed to preserve the contents with the same permanence as the Duke's own tunnels. When the forensic team finally pried back the heavy lead lid, there was a momentary, suffocating silence. The first thing to greet the investigators was the smell. It was not the sharp stench of fresh rot, but a heavy, earthy, chemical musk, the scent of static time. It was the smell of 40 years of total isolation suddenly meeting the moisture of the London fog. It was the smell of the Duke's entire life, preserved, hidden, and now violently exposed. As the lanterns were lowered into the depths of the casket, the Druce myth was liquidated in a single second. The visual evidence was absolute. The coffin did not contain lead weights. It did not contain the stones of a mock burial. It contained the well-preserved, bearded remain of an aged man. The grey beard was the final, devastating piece of forensic evidence. It was the physical proof that Thomas Charles Druce had lived and died as himself, a furniture dealer, entirely independent of the Cavendish-Bentinck bloodline. This was the forensic reveal. The secret tunnel was a hallucination funded by greed. The double life was a lie built to fill a void. The Duke had not been a shopkeeper. He had been exactly what the tunnel suggested, a man who was truly, deeply alone. The court's resolution was swift and devastating. The entire Druce claim was dismissed as vexatious. The vacuum of identity the Duke had created was finally closed, not by a secret, but by a corpse. The lawyers were dismissed, the investors were ruined, and the silent master of Welbeck Abbey was finally left to the history books. The 5th Duke of Portland did not leave a legacy of influence. He left a 15-mile map of his own disappearance. He proved that with enough capital, a human being can effectively liquidate their own existence while still drawing breath. The tunnels at Welbeck Abbey remain today, dark, cold, and perfectly silent. They are the ultimate monument to a man who paid a fortune to be forgotten, only to have his silence filled by the loudest of lies. He sought to occupy no space, yet his absence created a story that occupied the world's attention for decades. The ground was not the foundation of his life. It was the material he used to bury his name. This concludes the forensic investigation into the 5th Duke of Portland. He was a man who lived in the deep, and in the deep, his truth remains. He was not a fraud, and he was not a monster. He was simply a man who realized that the only way to truly own his life was to ensure that no one else could ever find it.